The first-class carriage trembled on the tracks as Penelope Ashford watched her gloved hands shaking in her lap. It wasn't the movement of the train that made them tremble, but the suffocating certainty that each rotation of the wheels brought her closer to a life she had not chosen. "Stop fidgeting like that, Penelope," reprimanded her mother, Lady Margaret Ashford, without lifting her eyes from the embroidery that occupied her hands. "A lady does not display disquiet. Mr. Morrison expects a refined wife, not a nervous child." Penelope bit her lower lip, holding back the words that burned in her throat. She was 22, an age considered almost late for marriage, but until 3 months ago she had imagined she would have some choice in the matter. Then came the letters from the creditors, the whispered meetings in her father's study, and finally Edward Morrison's proposal. A middle-aged banker, known for his coldness in business and his willingness to acquire whatever he desired, be it an estate or a wife of aristocratic lineage. "We should thank Providence," her mother continued, her fingers working methodically on the fabric. "Mr. Morrison offered generous terms. Ashford Hall will remain in the family, your father's debts will be settled, and you will have a residence in London. Many young ladies would change places with you without hesitation." Penelope turned her face to the window, watching the English landscape slide by in shades of green and grey under the overcast September sky of 1846. The trees seemed to wave goodbye, as if they knew she was travelling towards an elegant prison. "I will check if the luggage is properly accommodated," Lady Margaret announced, rising with a rustle of silk skirts. "Behave properly. Do not speak to strangers and maintain the composure I have taught you." When the compartment door closed, Penelope allowed herself to exhale the air she had been holding in her lungs. She closed her eyes, trying to calm the panic that grew in her chest like a wild vine. She had mentally wed herself to the idea of sacrifice, convinced herself that duty to her family outweighed any personal dream. But now, confined in that carriage that inexorably carried her to the altar, she felt like a bird watching the bars of its cage close. "Forgive my intrusion, but you dropped this." The male voice, soft and polite, made Penelope open her eyes abruptly. A young man stood at the compartment's entrance, holding the embroidered handkerchief she hadn't even noticed slipping from her hands. He was approximately 30, with brown hair slightly dishevelled by the journey, and grey-hued eyes that resembled the sky before a storm. He wore a quality suit, but without the excessive ostentation of the high aristocracy, and there was something in his posture that suggested a man accustomed to physical labour, not merely drawing rooms. "Thank you, sir," Penelope responded, accepting the handkerchief and noticing the blush that rose to her cheeks. "It was careless of me." "The fault is entirely the train's," he said with a smile that unexpectedly lit up his face. "These new carriages sway terribly. I am James Cooper, a railway engineer. I was inspecting the mechanisms when I saw your handkerchief fly down the corridor like a startled dove." Penelope couldn't help but smile at the comparison. "Penelope Ashford. It's a pleasure, Mr. Cooper." "Are you travelling alone, miss?" James asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice, not the intrusive curiosity she usually encountered in strangers. "My mother will return shortly. We are travelling to Hampshire, where—" She hesitated, unable to pronounce the words. "Where I will attend a family engagement." James inclined his head slightly, and Penelope had the disturbing impression that he saw beyond her carefully chosen words. There was sharp intelligence in those grey eyes, and something more, an understanding that made her heart clench in a strange way. "I should not entertain you," Penelope said, though every fibre of her being wished otherwise. "Surely you have important duties." "In fact, my inspection is complete, and the boredom of travelling alone is considerable," James replied. "If you will allow me the audacity, and if you do not consider it improper, I would appreciate conversing until your mother returns. I promise to maintain the respectable distance that decency demands." Penelope knew she should refuse. She knew her mother would be horrified to find her speaking with a stranger, however polite and clearly a gentleman. But something in James's open expression, in the promise of a few minutes of genuine conversation before surrendering her life to Edward Morrison, made her nod slightly. "I would be grateful for the company, Mr. Cooper, but I ask that you sit there near the door. My mother has very strict principles regarding propriety." James settled into the indicated seat, maintaining a distance that would not offend even the most stringent chaperone. "Then I must enjoy every moment of this sanctioned conversation," he said with humor. "Tell me, Miss Ashford, what do you think of this wonder of modern engineering that transports us?" And so they began to converse, initially about trivialities, the workings of steam trains, the changes that railways brought to England. But gradually, like water finding cracks in stone, the conversation deepened. James spoke of his work with evident passion, of how he designed bridges and calculated stresses, of dreams of building a railway that would cross mountains considered impassable. "Most people in my position would consider such work unsuitable," Penelope commented, fascinated by the way his eyes shone as he described projects. "They say gentlemen should live off their incomes, not by manual labor." "And do you share that opinion, miss?" James asked, studying her intently. Penelope considered the question carefully. "I believe there is more nobility in creating something of value than simply inheriting titles and estates, but my opinion matters little in the grand scheme of things." There was bitterness in her words, and she saw James perceive it. "I respectfully disagree," he said softly. "Your opinions seem to me those of a person who thinks deeply, and such opinions always matter, regardless of what society dictates." No one had ever said anything like that to Penelope. Throughout her life, she had been instructed to hold opinions only on matters appropriate for ladies: embroidery, floral arrangements, perhaps edifying literature. Her thoughts on deeper questions were considered improper, even troublesome. "And you, miss," James continued, leaning slightly forward, though he maintained the respectable distance. "What are your dreams, if I may ask such a presumably impertinent question?" Penelope opened her mouth to offer the polite and empty answer she had rehearsed for years, but the words that emerged were different. "I dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world beyond country estates and London drawing rooms. I dreamed of having choices, of deciding the course of my own life." She stopped, shocked by her own honesty. "Forgive me, I don't know why I said that." "Because they are true dreams," James responded, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made Penelope's heart quicken. "And true dreams demand to be expressed, even when the world conspires to suffocate them." The train began to slow, and Penelope realized with regret that they must be approaching a station. Her mother would return at any moment, and this extraordinary conversation would end. "The engagement in Hampshire," James said softly, as if reading her thoughts. "It's a marriage, isn't it?" Penelope nodded, unable to trust her voice. "And is it what you desire, miss?" The words hung between them, laden with meanings that Penelope barely dared to consider. Outside the window, the sky darkened rapidly, heavy clouds gathering on the horizon. A storm was approaching, both literally and metaphorically. Before she could answer, the train shook violently. The violent shaking turned into a metallic roar. Penelope clutched the armrest as the carriage tilted dangerously sideways. Screams echoed down the corridor, muffled by the deafening screech of iron twisting against the tracks. Through the window, the world became a blur of green and grey spinning at impossible angles. "Hold on!" James crossed the compartment in 2 swift strides, ignoring the respectable distance he had promised to maintain. His arms enveloped Penelope, protecting her with his own body as the carriage slid sideways. The impact when they hit the ground was brutal, throwing them against the wall with enough force to knock the air from her lungs. For an interminable moment, there was only darkness, and the sound of her own gasping breath mingled with James's. Then, gradually, silence settled, broken only by the distant groans of other passengers and the hiss of escaping steam. "Are you hurt?" James's voice was hoarse, his face so close that Penelope could feel his breath against her cheek. His hands moved carefully over her arms, checking for injuries without impropriety. "I don't believe so," Penelope responded, though every muscle in her body protested. "And you?" "Unharmed." James moved back slightly, allowing her space to breathe. The compartment was now tilted at a sharp angle, the velvet curtains hanging grotesquely, the leather seats ripped where metal had pierced them. "We need to get out of here. The boiler might be compromised." The mention of the boiler brought a new wave of panic. Penelope had heard stories of explosions in derailments, of passengers burned alive in overturned carriages. "My mother, She was in the adjacent carriage. "We will find your mother," James promised with a firmness that admitted no doubt. "But first I need to get you out of here safely." He moved through the destroyed cabin with the certainty of one who intimately understood the mechanics of disaster. The door was jammed, the hinges twisted by the impact. James examined it briefly before turning to the window. With a single fluid movement, he removed his coat and rapped his fist, shattering the already cracked glass. "Forgive my impropriety," he said, and before Penelope could comprehend his intention, he took her by the waist. His hands were firm but careful, and there was something simultaneously disturbing and comforting in the way he lifted her with no apparent effort. "Mind the shards." He passed her through the broken window to the outside, where the rain was beginning to fall in heavy drops. The ground was muddy and uneven, covered in debris. Penelope fell to her knees, her skirts soaking immediately, but she was out. She was alive. James emerged moments later, helping her to her feet. Around them, the scene was one of complete devastation. The train lay snaked along a sloping stretch of track, 3 carriages completely overturned, others partially derailed. Black smoke rose from the locomotive, and the acrid smell of heated metal mingled with the scent of wet earth. "Stay here," James instructed, but Penelope clutched his sleeve. "Don't leave me, please." The plea escaped before she could contain it, vulnerable and childlike. Everything her mother had taught her never to display. But at that moment, with death still so near and the world transformed into chaos, social conventions seemed absurdly irrelevant. James covered her hand with his, and the warmth of that simple touch penetrated her soaked gloves. "Very well, but stay close." They moved through the disaster, like ghosts navigating the wreckage of civilization. Other passengers emerged from the carriages, some injured, others in shock. An elderly gentleman bled profusely from a cut on his forehead. A young lady sobbed convulsively while her companion tried to calm her. An engine driver ran from carriage to carriage, shouting names and instructions. "Mother!" Penelope saw the familiar figure emerging from the carriage ahead, her silk dress torn, her hair escaping its elaborate coiffure. "Mother, I'm here!" Lady Margaret turned, and the relief that crossed her face was so intense that for a moment she seemed human, vulnerable, not the inflexible figure of authority Penelope had known all her life. "Penelope, thank heavens!" She ran, forgetting all dignity, and embraced her daughter with surprising force. "I thought I had lost you. When the carriage overturned, I thought, 'I'm well, Mother,' unharmed." Penelope returned the embrace, feeling something soften in her chest. It had been so long since they had experienced such a display of affection. It was then that Lady Margaret noticed James, standing respectfully a few paces away, soaked by the increasing rain. Her face transformed, maternal relief giving way to aristocratic distrust. "Who is this gentleman?" "Mr. James Cooper, my lady," James responded before Penelope could speak, bowing courteously despite the extraordinary circumstances. "A railway engineer. I had the good fortune to be in the adjacent compartment when the derailment occurred. I helped your daughter escape the overturned carriage." Lady Margaret's expression softened marginally. "Then we are indebted to you, Mr. Cooper. I thank you for your timely intervention." "Any gentleman would have done the same," James replied, but his eyes met Penelope's, and there was something in that gaze that made her heart quicken alarmingly. "The boiler!" The shout came from the engine driver, cutting through the murmur of injured voices. "The boiler is compromised! Get away from the locomotive!" Panic spread instantly. Passengers who moments before had been immobilized by shock began to run, stumbling over debris and mud, desperate to put distance between themselves and the threat of explosion. James gripped the arms of both women. "To the fields, quickly!" His voice had the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations, and both Penelope and Lady Margaret followed him without question. They ran through the rain that now fell in torrents, Penelope's skirts weighing like anchors, each step a battle against the mud that sucked at her delicate shoes. James kept himself between them and the doomed railway, a living shield against the imminent danger. They had reached the edge of a woodland when the explosion came. It wasn't the dramatic bang Penelope had imagined, but a muffled roar followed by a column of steam and flames that rose into the stormy sky. The heat reached them even at that distance, and fragments of metal rained down on the field like deadly hail. James pulled them down, shielding them again with his own body as the debris fell. Penelope found herself pressed against the wet earth, his weight on her back, James's heart beating against her shoulder blades in a frantic rhythm that matched her own. When it was finally safe to rise, what remained of the train was in flames. The rain fought against the fire in a Sisyphean battle, steam rising in ghostly clouds. Figures moved through the smoke, faces streaked with soot, expressions dazed. "I would have died there," Lady Margaret murmured, watching the flames consume the carriage where she had been sitting minutes before. Her voice was devoid of emotion, too shocked to fully process the proximity of death. "If I had remained in the compartment just a few moments longer—" "But you didn't," Penelope said firmly, squeezing her mother's trembling hand. "We are alive. We are all alive." Around them, other survivors began to gather, counting heads, searching for the lost. The elderly gentleman was being tended to by a lady with improvised medical knowledge. The hysterical young lady had been calmed by her companion. A boy cried for his mother, and Penelope felt her heart break upon hearing him. "I need to help," James said, already moving towards the injured. "There are people trapped in the carriages. They need strong hands to free them." "Go," Penelope encouraged him. "We will do what we can here." He hesitated, studying her face with an intensity that made her cheeks burn despite the cold rain. "When this is over, when everyone is safe, we need to talk." It was not a request. It was a statement of intent, laden with meanings that Penelope barely dared to examine. She nodded, unable to form words, and watched him disappear into the smoke and confusion. Lady Margaret followed her daughter's gaze, and something sharp crossed her face. "Penelope, we need to discuss what happens now. Now we need to help the injured," Penelope responded, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. "Everything else can wait." For the first time in her life, she moved away from her mother without permission, heading towards a woman holding an injured child. The conventions that had governed her 22 years of existence seemed to have derailed along with the train, leaving her in uncharted territory where the old rules no longer applied. And as she worked among the survivors, tearing her petticoats to make bandages, comforting the frightened, Penelope discovered something extraordinary. She discovered that when death lurked so near, when all the pretenses of society were stripped away by disaster, what remained was simple and true. Kindness mattered. Courage mattered. Genuine human connection mattered more than all the ballrooms and marriage contracts in the world. Night fell upon the wreckage like a mantle of black velvet, and with it came a penetrating cold that made the survivors huddle around makeshift bonfires. Penelope had never imagined that fire could be simultaneously comforting and terrifying, but there she was, warming her hands over flames fed by fragments of the very train that had almost killed her. They had counted 17 injured, 3 seriously, but miraculously no fatalities. The engine driver attributed the extraordinary luck to the fact that the derailment had occurred on a relatively flat stretch, before the steep descent that lay ahead. If they had lost control there, on the treacherous curves of the Hampshire hills, none of them would be alive to gaze at the stars now emerging between the scattered clouds. "Drink this." James appeared beside Penelope, offering a metal mug with something steaming. "It's just hot water, with a little brandy the conductor kept for emergencies. It will help against the cold." Penelope accepted the mug, her fingers brushing his briefly. Even through her soaked gloves she felt the warmth of that touch, and something more, an electric current that had nothing to do with temperature. "Thank you. For the rescue. For the water. For everything." James sat on a nearby log, maintaining an appropriate distance, though both knew that social conventions seemed absurd after what they had witnessed. His face was streaked with soot, his hair disheveled, his shirt torn where he had helped extract a passenger trapped under twisted metal. Even so, or perhaps because of it, Penelope had never seen a man so attractive. "No need to thank me," he said softly. "Anyone would have done the same." "That's not true." Penelope observed the other survivors scattered around the makeshift camp. Some were helping, as James had tirelessly done for the past hours. Others sat in silent shock or complained bitterly about their lost belongings, seemingly unable to comprehend that they had just escaped death. You chose to repeatedly put yourself in harm's way to save strangers. That speaks of a rare character. And you tore your petticoats to make bandages, James retorted with a smile that lit up his tired eyes. I imagine that is considered scandalous in proper circles. Penelope laughed, a surprisingly light sound considering the circumstances. My mother nearly fainted when she saw. Not for the waste of fine fabric, I believe, but for the impropriety of exposing ankles, even if only for medical purposes. Where is Lady Margaret now? In the shelter, the gentleman constructed with tarpaulins and branches, resting. The experience was exhausting for her. Penelope hesitated before continuing. She isn't as stern as she seems, just frightened. My father lost almost everything through imprudent investments. She tries to protect what remains in the only way she knows. Through your marriage to the banker, it was not a question. James stated the fact in a carefully neutral voice, but Penelope saw something darken in his eyes. Edward Morrison, she confirmed, pronouncing the name for the first time aloud since the derailment. He is cruel, James completed when she spoke. You said he was cruel in that conversation before the disaster. I remember every word you uttered, Penelope. The use of her given name without a formal title should have shocked her, but it only made her heart quicken. I don't know him well enough to judge him so, she said, though she knew she lied. Stories about Morrison circulated through society like crows bearing ill tidings. He had ruined businessmen who dared to compete with him, evicted families from their properties without compassion, and it was said his first wife had died under suspicious circumstances, though nothing could be proven. But you would if you could, James said softly, if you had a choice. Penelope turned to face him completely, and there, in the flickering light of the bonfire, she saw reflected in his face the same tumultuous emotion that she felt growing in her own chest. It was madness. They had known each other for less than a day, and most of that time had been consumed by disaster and survival. But there was something between them, something that transcended time and convention, as real as the heat of the flames or the cold of the night air. What does it matter if I would or wouldn't? The words came out more bitterly than she intended. I have no choice. My family depends on this marriage. Ashford Hall, our home for 7 generations, will be lost if I don't marry Morrison. My parents will be ruined, without reputation, without means of sustenance. How can I choose my happiness over theirs? What if there were another way? There isn't. Penelope rose abruptly, the emotion becoming unbearable. Please, don't make this more difficult than it already is. When dawn breaks, we will proceed to Hampshire. I will marry Morrison as planned, and you will return to your life of bridges and railways. That is how it must be. She began to move away, but James rose too, his hand gently closing around her wrist. Penelope, listen to me. Just listen. She stopped, unable to pull free, unable to want to. Tears burned in her eyes, blurred by exhaustion and emotion. I have savings, James said quickly, the words tumbling out as if he feared losing them if he didn't release them immediately. I am not rich, but my work pays well, and I have been prudent. I could help your family. Not with the entire sum Morrison offers, but perhaps enough to save the estate, to give them time to rebuild. Penelope turned slowly, barely daring to believe what she heard. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Because in those hours on the train, conversing about dreams and freedom, I came to know your heart. And in the disaster that followed, I saw your courage. James took a step closer, his eyes searching hers with fierce intensity. Because in one day I have come to know you better than most people know each other in entire years. And because the idea of you being given to a cruel man, living a life without choices, without happiness, is intolerable. You are speaking madness, Penelope whispered, but her heart sang with dangerous possibility. You cannot simply offer to marry me after knowing me for hours. I am not offering marriage, not yet. James smiled, and there was humor in that smile despite the seriousness of the conversation. It would be improper to propose matrimony to a lady without proper courtship, without permission from her family. I am offering an alternative, time, a possibility of choice where there was none before. My mother would never agree. Then convince her. You have more strength than you imagine, Penelope. I saw it today. The woman who tore her own clothes to help strangers, who remained calm while others panicked, that woman can do anything she sets her mind to. Penelope closed her eyes, the world spinning around her. It was too much temptation, too much hope after so long accepting the inevitable. What if your savings are not enough? What if my father refuses your help out of pride? There are so many ways for this to fail. Then we will fail trying, James said with devastating simplicity. But at least we will have tried. At least we won't spend our lives wondering what might have been. A cry cut through the night before Penelope could respond. Both turned to see one of the injured women convulsing near one of the bonfires, her husband desperately calling for help. James released Penelope's hand and ran, and she followed him instinctively, the unfinished conversation suspended between them like an unfulfilled promise. The woman had a fever, her body burning despite the night cold. "The wound is infected," James murmured after examining the deep cut on her arm. "We need to clean it properly, but we don't have sufficient medical supplies." "There's a village about 3 kilometers from here," the engine driver informed, appearing from the dark. "I sent 2 men to seek help as soon as night fell, but they haven't returned yet." 3 kilometers is a considerable distance in the dark, James said, concern marking his face, especially if they don't know the area well. "I do." Penelope was surprised to hear her own voice. "We visited a nearby estate when I was a child. I remember the way." "Absolutely not." Lady Margaret emerged from the shelter, apparently awakened by the commotion. "You will not wander through the darkness like a common peasant. That woman will die if we don't get help, Mother." Penelope faced her mother with a firmness she hadn't known she possessed until that moment. "And I am the only one here who knows the way." "Then one of the men will go, and you will describe the route." "The men have already gone and lost their way," Penelope argued. "The path is not obvious. It requires knowledge of specific landmarks." "I will go with her," James intervened. "I will keep her safe, Lady Margaret, you have my word." Lady Margaret looked between them, and Penelope saw sharp understanding cross her mother's face. "You have already decided, haven't you, regardless of what I say?" "Yes," Penelope responded simply. "I have decided." For a long moment, no one spoke. The injured woman groaned again, her husband holding her hand as tears ran down his face. The fire crackled. The wind blew through the trees with a sound that seemed to contain all the unspoken warnings. "Go then," Lady Margaret finally said, her voice heavy with resignation. "But be back before dawn, and Penelope." She hesitated, something softening in her stern expression. "Be careful, not just with the physical path." Penelope embraced her mother quickly, surprised to feel Lady Margaret's arms tighten in return. "I will be careful, I promise." 15 minutes later, equipped with a lantern, blankets, and Penelope's directions, she and James left the circle of light from the bonfires and entered the darkness. The moon had risen, almost full, painting the world in silver and shadows. Penelope led the way through the field, then along a stone wall towards the woodland she knew from childhood memories. They walked in silence initially, each lost in thought. Then James spoke, his voice low but clear in the silent night. "When you said you had decided, what did you mean?" Penelope stopped, turning to face him in the moonlight. Her heart beat so loudly that she was sure he could hear it. "I decided that you are right, that it is worth trying even if we fail, that a life lived by one's own choice, even if more difficult, is worth more than a life in a gilded cage." She breathed deeply. "I decided that I want to know you better, James Cooper, properly, with courtship and time and all the conventions that society demands. And if at the end of that process we discover that what we felt tonight was real, then we will face what comes together." James did not respond with words. Instead, he took her hand, interlacing his fingers through hers, even through her gloves, and together they continued through the night, towards the help that would save a stranger's life. The village of Millbrook slept beneath the moon's silver mantle when Penelope and James finally emerged from the woods. Their clothes were drenched with dew, her shoes ruined by mud, but they had found their way. The small stone church stood in the center of the square, its bell tower casting long shadows over the surrounding thatched roof houses. There, Penelope pointed to a larger building at the edge of the village. "The doctor lives in that house. I recognize the green porch." They knocked on the door urgently, the sound echoing down the silent street. Moments later, an upstairs window opened, and a middle-aged man with greying hair peered out holding a candle. "Who knocks at this ungodly hour?" His voice carried irritation, but also concern. A doctor in a small village was accustomed to nocturnal emergencies. "Doctor, there's been a derailment 3 miles from here," James called out. "There are injured people needing urgent medical attention, a woman with a high fever from infection." The irritation evaporated instantly. "Wait, I'll be right down." 5 minutes later, Dr. Whitmore, wearing a coat over his nightclothes and carrying a bulky medical bag, was following them back through the darkness. He had also brought his modest carriage, pulled by an aged but sturdy horse, laden with supplies that could save lives. "I heard the crash earlier," he said as he guided the horse carefully along the uneven path. "I thought it was thunder, but now I understand. The express train to London?" "The very same," James confirmed. "The storm must have weakened the tracks. We overturned on the bend before the descent." "Merciful providence that it wasn't on the descent itself," the doctor murmured. "I've attended to railway accidents before. It's not a sight for the faint of heart." Penelope, sitting beside James in the back of the carriage, felt him shiver slightly. Her hand found his in the dark, and he intertwined their fingers in a gesture that was becoming alarmingly familiar. "You saved many people today," she whispered, too low for the doctor to hear. "Without your knowledge of the carriage structure, without your courage, there would have been many more injured. And without you guiding us here, that woman would have died." James turned to look at her, and even in the darkness of the carriage, Penelope felt the weight of that gaze. "We make a good team, it seems." The words were simple, yet they carried profound implications. A team. Partners. Not the one-sided arrangement her marriage to Morrison would be, where she would serve as a decorative ornament and producer of heirs, but something balanced, where both contributed equally. When they reached the survivors' camp, it was almost midnight. The campfires still burned, and Penelope saw with relief that the injured woman still lived, though her husband seemed to have aged 10 years since they had left. Dr. Whitmore worked with impressive efficiency. He cleaned the infected wound, applied pungent-smelling unguents, administered careful doses of laudanum for the pain. He examined each of the injured, adjusting bandages, stitching cuts that required sutures, offering reassuring words along with his medical care. "Everyone will survive," he finally announced to the gathered group, "but they need proper shelter and rest. My village is small, but we will welcome everyone until transport can be arranged." The gratitude was palpable. Some passengers openly wept. Others simply nodded, too exhausted for words. Lady Margaret approached Penelope, studying her daughter's face with an expression the young woman couldn't decipher. "You did well," her mother said finally, and there was something new in her voice. Not approval exactly, but recognition. Respect, perhaps. "Your father would be proud." Penelope felt tears sting her eyes. "Thank you, Mama. But we must talk in the morning when we are both rested." Lady Margaret cast a significant glance in the direction of James, who was helping to carry medical supplies. "There are decisions that need to be made, and we cannot postpone them indefinitely." The weight of the real world descended upon Penelope's shoulders once more. For a few hours, moving through the night with clear purpose, she had almost managed to forget what awaited her. Morrison. The marriage. The life she had accepted as inevitable before a railway engineer with storm-colored eyes offered her something impossible: choice. The village of Millbrook welcomed the survivors with generosity that warmed as much as their hearths. Families opened their homes, offering beds, simple but hearty meals, clean clothes to replace those ruined by the disaster. Penelope and Lady Margaret were settled in the vicarage with a gentleman and an even gentler wife who insisted on preparing them a hot bath before bed. But Penelope could not sleep. Lying in the small but immaculately clean room, listening to her mother's steady breathing in the adjacent bed, her mind spun in incessant circles. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw James's face. She saw the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of his projects. She remembered the warmth of his hands, protecting her when the carriage overturned. She heard his voice offering her the impossible: time, choice, the possibility of true love. But she also saw her father's face when the creditor's letters arrived. She remembered her mother's devastated expression upon realizing they would lose everything. Ashford Hall, her family's home for generations, would be sold to pay debts. Her parents would grow old in poverty, dependent on the charity of relatives who judged them for their financial imprudence. Morrison could save them. His wealth was vast, and he had offered generous terms. All he demanded in return was Penelope, her youth, her freedom, her unfulfilled dreams. A small price, her mother had insisted, for the salvation of the entire family. But was it truly small? Now that she had met James, now that she had glimpsed what a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine attraction could be, the idea of giving herself to Morrison seemed not a noble sacrifice, but a betrayal of herself. "You're not sleeping," Lady Margaret's voice cut through the darkness, soft but clear. "I can hear your agitated thoughts from here." Penelope turned in the narrow bed. "Forgive me for disturbing you, Mama." There was a long silence. Then her mother sighed, a sound laden with emotions she rarely allowed herself to express. "When I was your age, I knew a young man, not your father but another, a poet with no fortune or property, only dreams and beautiful words." Penelope propped herself up on her elbows, shocked. Her mother had never mentioned such a thing. What happened? "My parents forbade the relationship naturally. He was not suitable. He couldn't offer the security your grandfather considered essential." Lady Margaret paused, and Penelope heard the rustle of bedclothes as her mother also sat up. "So I married your father, who was suitable, who had property and appropriate lineage, and I convinced myself that I had made the right choice." "Mama," Penelope didn't know what to say. "Your father is a good man. I learned to love him in a way. We had a comfortable life, healthy children. But some nights, I still dream of that poet, and imagine what my life would have been like if I had had the courage to choose differently." The words hung between them, an extraordinary confession from a woman who had spent her life upholding social conventions and duty above personal emotion. "Why are you telling me this?" Penelope asked. "Because I saw how you look at that engineer, and I saw how he looks at you." Lady Margaret rose, moving across the dark room to sit on the edge of Penelope's bed. "Because I don't want you to spend your life wondering what might have been. Because even sacrifice has its limits, and perhaps we have asked too much of you." Penelope felt tears run down her face. "But the estate, Papa's debts, everything Morrison offered. It's money. Penelope, just money." Her mother took her hand in the darkness, and Penelope realized she was also crying. "Ashford Hall is just stones and land, but your happiness, your entire life, that cannot be recovered once squandered." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if that young Cooper can truly help, if his savings are enough to prevent complete ruin, then perhaps we should consider his offer. And even if it's not enough, even if we lose everything, I'd rather live modestly knowing my daughter is happy than in a mansion bought with her tears." Penelope hugged her mother tightly, sobbing against her shoulder as she hadn't since childhood. Lady Margaret held her firmly, stroking her hair, murmuring comforts that seemed intended for herself as much as for her daughter. "But we need to be practical," her mother finally said, gently pulling away. "You barely know this man. Disaster and danger can create illusions of connection that won't withstand the light of day. We need time to assess his character, his true intentions, his ability to provide." "He offered a proper courtship," Penelope said. "Time for us to get to know each other appropriately. Then we will accept his offer. But Morrison needs to be informed immediately. It would be dishonest to keep him waiting while you explore other possibilities." Lady Margaret paused. "He will not be pleased. Men like Morrison do not take rejection well." A shiver ran down Penelope's spine. "Do you think he will cause trouble?" "I think we must be prepared for consequences. Morrison has considerable influence. He can make it difficult for your father to rebuild his financial reputation. He can spread damaging rumors about you." Her mother squeezed her hand. "But we will face this together if it is your choice." Penelope took a deep breath, feeling something settle in her chest. Certainty, purpose. For the first time in months she felt in control of her own destiny. "It is my choice. I want time to get to know James properly. I want to see if what we feel is real or just an illusion created by extraordinary circumstances. And if it is real—" She paused, daring to imagine the future she had begun to desire. If it is real, then I will choose happiness over convenience, love over duty." "Then it is decided," Lady Margaret said firmly. "In the morning, we will speak with Mr. Cooper about the practical details, and I will send a telegram to Morrison cancelling the arrangements." They slept then, mother and daughter embracing in the narrow bed while outside the moon completed its journey across the sky. And when dawn finally broke, painting the world in shades of gold and rose, Penelope awoke feeling something she had not experienced in a long time: hope. The morning brought with it a clarity that seemed excessively cruel after the emotions of the previous night. Penelope put on the outfit borrowed from the vicar's wife, a simple blue wool dress that contrasted drastically with the silks and laces she was accustomed to. Somehow that simplicity seemed appropriate to what she was about to do: rebuild her life on honest foundations, not on empty pretenses. James awaited in the small garden behind the vicarage, politely discussing the technical details of the derailment with Dr. Whitmore. When he saw Penelope approach, something lit up in his face that made her heart skip irregularly. It wasn't just physical attraction, though there certainly was that, but a deeper recognition, as if long-separated souls had finally reunited. "Miss Ashford," he greeted formally, bowing appropriately, "I hope you rested well." "As well as possible, considering the circumstances," she replied, aware that Lady Margaret was watching from the window. "My mother would like to speak with us. There are matters that need to be discussed." Something passed through James's eyes, apprehension mixed with hope. He nodded silently and followed her inside, where Lady Margaret awaited them in the vicar's small sitting room. Her mother had recovered some of her usual composure, though her dress was also borrowed, and her hair was pinned in a much simpler arrangement than usual. "Mr. Cooper," Lady Margaret began without preamble, indicating that he should sit. "My daughter has informed me of your extraordinary offer. Before we proceed, I need to understand exactly what you are proposing." James sat on the edge of the chair, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on his knees. There was in him a quiet dignity that came not from an aristocratic birth, but from character developed through honest work and solid principles. "I propose to assist your family financially, Lady Margaret, to the extent of my capabilities. I have saved for years, living modestly despite my considerable earnings. I can offer a substantial sum to help settle the most urgent debts." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "In return, I ask only for the opportunity to court your daughter properly. I do not expect immediate commitment or promises. Only time for us to get to know one another, to discover if what we feel under these extraordinary circumstances can translate into a solid foundation for a shared life." "Substantial sum," Lady Margaret repeated, and there was skepticism in her voice. "Forgive my frankness, Mr. Cooper, but my husband's debts are considerable. I fear that your savings, however admirable, may be inadequate." James was not offended. Instead, he took a sealed envelope from the inner pocket of his coat. "I took the liberty of preparing this document overnight. It lists my financial assets with complete accuracy, including verification from my bank in London. I ask that you examine it and make your own assessments." Penelope watched her mother open the envelope and read the contents, seeing surprise cross her usually controlled face. "This is considerable, Mr. Cooper, far more than I had anticipated from someone in your profession." "Railway engineering pays extraordinarily well for those with specialized expertise," James explained without arrogance, "and I have been consulted on several large-scale projects. Furthermore, I inherited a modest property from an uncle who had no other heirs. I am not wealthy like Morrison, but neither am I indigent." Lady Margaret studied him for a long moment, and Penelope could see the calculating assessment happening behind those sharp eyes. Her mother was no fool. She had survived decades navigating the treacherous waters of aristocratic society, and she knew how to recognize true character when she saw it. "Even if your financial offer is adequate," she finally said, "there are practical matters that need to be considered. Mr. Morrison will not accept this development graciously. He has considerable influence, and powerful men often become vengeful when crossed." "I am aware of the risks," James replied calmly, "and I am prepared to face them." "You are," Lady Margaret said with a hint of irony. "But what about Penelope and your family? Morrison can ruin my husband's reputation. He can use his influence to ensure we never recover our social standing. Are you prepared to take responsibility for these consequences?" "Mama," Penelope intervened, unable to remain silent any longer. "These consequences will be the result of my choices, not his, and I am willing to accept them." "You say that now when the possibility of romantic love seems worth any sacrifice," her mother retorted, but there was a softness in her voice. "But when you face social ostracism, when doors close, when friendships vanish, you may feel differently." "Then I will feel differently," Penelope replied with a conviction that surprised her. "But at least I will have made my own choices, lived my own life. That is worth more than the approval of people who value convention above humanity." James looked at her with an expression that made her cheeks burn, admiration and something deeper shining in his grey eyes. "Miss Ashford is right. And if I may add, Lady Margaret, I believe you underestimate your family's resilience. I saw yesterday how you worked together during the crisis, how you demonstrated courage and compassion when it would have been easier to surrender to despair. These qualities will not disappear when you face social challenges." Lady Margaret sighed, and for the first time since Penelope could remember, her mother seemed less like an imposing figure of authority and more like a weary woman who had carried heavy burdens for too long. "Very well," she finally said, "but let us establish clear terms. Mr. Cooper, you will have 3 months to court Penelope properly. During that time, you will visit our home as protocol allows, you will correspond with her under my supervision, and you will demonstrate through actions, not just words, that you are worthy of her trust. At the end of these 3 months, if you both still wish to proceed, we will discuss marital arrangements." "And Morrison?" Penelope asked. "I will write to him today, informing him that unforeseen circumstances have made it impossible to honor our previous agreement." Lady Margaret paused. "I will not mention Mr. Cooper. It will be better for everyone if Morrison believes you have simply decided you cannot marry him, not that you have found a preferable alternative." "He will come to us," Penelope said with certainty. "He will demand explanations. Let him come, your father and I will handle it." Her mother rose, indicating that the meeting was concluded. "Now, Mr. Cooper, I suggest you return to London and organize your affairs. Arrange for the transfer of the funds you offered and prepare for a proper courtship. You will be welcome at Ashford Hall within 2 weeks, once we have returned and settled properly." James rose also, bowing respectfully. "I thank you for your trust, Lady Margaret. I will not disappoint you." He turned to Penelope, and for the first time, allowed true emotion to show on his face. "Miss Ashford, I will eagerly await our next meeting." "As will I, Mr. Cooper," Penelope replied, feeling warmth rise from her neck to her cheeks. "Travel safely." When he left, Lady Margaret turned to her daughter with an unreadable expression. "I hope you know what you're doing, Penelope. The path you have chosen will be infinitely more difficult than the one you refused." "I know, Mama," Penelope replied, watching through the window as James disappeared down the dusty road. "But it will be my path, freely chosen. And that makes all the difference." 3 days later, when they finally managed transport back to Ashford Hall, Penelope carried a letter from James in her pocket. He had written formally, respectfully, but between the lines she could read promises of a future they dared to imagine together. And for the first time in months, she looked ahead not with dread, but with cautious hope and growing excitement about what was to come. The true test both knew was yet to come. Morrison would need to be faced, society would need to be navigated, and they themselves would need to discover if the connection forged in disaster and danger could translate into lasting love under the ordinary light of day. But at least they would have a chance to try. And for now, that chance was enough. The carriage swayed gently along the rural roads of Hampshire, but Penelope barely noticed the movement. Her hands trembled slightly over the envelope that had arrived that morning. Morrison's red seal already broken, the words inside burning in her mind like still smouldering embers. "He will come tomorrow," she said in a low voice, watching her mother from across the compartment. "The letter is disturbing." Lady Margaret held out her hand, and Penelope passed her the paper. She watched her mother's face harden as she read the lines written in aggressively slanted handwriting. Morrison had not accepted the dissolution of their marital agreement with the grace they had hoped for. His words were outwardly courteous, but carried veiled threats of social and financial consequences that would surely come. "He mentions conversations with your father's creditors," Lady Margaret murmured, her eyes scanning the text again. "He suggests that certain debts could be called in immediately if there is no reconciliation of our previous understanding." "It's blackmail," Penelope said, feeling anger replace the fear she had initially felt. "He can do exactly that." Her mother folded the letter carefully, as if handling something dangerous. "Morrison has considerable influence in the financial world. If he decides to make things difficult for your father, there is little we can do to stop him." Penelope turned to the window, watching the familiar lands of Ashford Hall appear in the distance. The green fields stretched beneath the October sky, the trees already beginning to dress themselves in shades of gold and crimson. That estate had been home to 7 generations of Ashfords. The idea of losing it because of her choices made her stomach churn. "Perhaps I should reconsider," she said quietly, though each word felt like a betrayal of the future she had begun to imagine with James. "If my marriage to Morrison can save all of this—" "No," Lady Margaret's voice was firm, surprisingly resolute. "We have discussed this already, Penelope. The price is too high. We will find another way." But as the carriage advanced along the oak-lined drive that led to the mansion, Penelope couldn't help but question if there truly was another way. James's funds were substantial, but Morrison was right in his letter. They would not be enough to settle all the debts. Some creditors would have to wait. Trust that they would eventually be paid. And if Morrison used his influence to convince them not to wait, to demand immediate payment, then everything would collapse regardless of James's good intentions. The mansion rose before them, grey stone against the autumnal sky, windows reflecting the evening light like eyes watching their return. Penelope felt something tighten in her chest. She loved that place. Every corridor and garden, every childhood memory spent exploring its secret nooks. How could she be responsible for its loss? Her father awaited in the entrance hall, and Penelope was shocked to see how he had aged in just 1 week. Lord Henry Ashford had always been a robust man, of an imposing stature that commanded respect, but now his shoulders sagged slightly, and there were deep lines around his mouth that she didn't remember seeing before. "Thank heavens you returned safely," he said, embracing them briefly, his gaze fixed on Penelope with an expression that mingled relief and something darker. Concern, perhaps, or guilt. "When we heard of the derailment, I thought, well, it doesn't matter what I thought. You are here, whole." "Morrison wrote," Lady Margaret said without preamble, handing him the letter. "He will come tomorrow." Lord Henry read in silence, his expression growing increasingly grim. When he finished, he folded the paper and returned it to his wife with deliberate care. "Then we will face this tomorrow. For now you must be exhausted. Rest, recover from your journey." "Papa," Penelope began, but he raised his hand gently. "Your mother has informed me of everything. About young Cooper, about his offer, about your decision." He paused, studying his daughter's face with an attention that made tears sting her eyes. "I cannot say I am pleased with the complications that will arise, but neither can I say that I blame you for choosing freedom over imprisonment, even if it is gilded." The admission had cost him something, Penelope could see. Her father was a man of traditional principles who believed in family duty and personal sacrifice. That he was willing to support her decision, even facing financial ruin, touched her deeply. "We will find a solution," she said with a conviction she did not entirely feel. "James will help, and we will work together to rebuild. I will not allow Morrison to destroy us." That night Penelope could barely eat during dinner. Her mind spun constantly, imagining the confrontation that would come in the morning. Morrison was not a man accustomed to being refused. What arguments would he use? What pressures would he apply? And more importantly, would she have the strength to resist when he painted in vivid colors the consequences of her refusal? She was in her room, preparing for bed, when soft knocks sounded at her door. Her mother entered, carrying something wrapped in brown paper. "I thought you should have this," Lady Margaret said, extending the package. "It belonged to your grandmother. Penelope unwrapped it carefully, revealing a diary bound in worn leather, the pages yellowed with age. Grandmama Ashford's diary? She kept it for years, starting when she was your age. Her mother sat on the edge of the bed, touching the book's cover with reverence. She faced a choice similar to yours, an arranged marriage to a rich but cruel man, or a life of uncertainty with the man she loved. Penelope opened the diary carefully, her eyes scanning the delicate handwriting that filled the pages. What did she choose? Read and discover, Lady Margaret said softly, but know that regardless of what you choose tomorrow, you are not alone. Your grandmother faced an impossible dilemma and found a way through it. So will you. After her mother left, Penelope spent hours reading her grandmother's words, absorbing the wisdom and courage of a woman who had lived decades before. The story unfolded in dated entries, narrating secret courtship, family pressures, and finally, a decision that changed everything. Her grandmother had chosen love over security, and although the following years had brought challenges, she had never regretted it. The heart knows truths that the mind takes time to comprehend, an entry read. When we find one who truly sees us, who values our soul as much as our standing, it would be a betrayal of ourselves to let him slip away for fear of what others will say. Penelope closed the diary as the candlelight flickered, feeling something strengthen within her. Her grandmother had faced a similar choice and survived, prospered even, and if that courageous woman's blood ran in her veins, then she too could find the strength to defend her decision. The morning arrived cold and clear, frost covering the gardens like powdered sugar. Penelope dressed with special care, choosing a dark green wool dress that made her seem older, more formidable. If she was to face Morrison, she would do so looking like a grown woman capable of making her own decisions, not a frightened girl easily intimidated. He arrived at midday, his polished carriage contrasting with the air of gentle decay that had begun to permeate Ashford Hall. Edward Morrison was exactly as Penelope remembered him, a man of 45 with dark hair greying at the temples, calculating eyes that assessed everything in terms of monetary value. He was impeccably dressed, every detail of his attire screaming wealth and power. Lord Ashford, Lady Margaret, he greeted courteously, his voice soft but carrying an underlying authority. Then his eyes fixed on Penelope, and she felt a chill run down her spine. Miss Ashford, what a pleasure to see you again, especially after hearing of your terrible ordeal in the derailment. Mr. Morrison, Penelope replied, keeping her voice steady, we appreciate your visit, though we imagine you understand the nature of the situation. Oh, I understand perfectly. He smiled, but there was no warmth in that smile. A young lady survives a traumatic disaster and suddenly questions established arrangements. It is understandable, though regrettable. They were led into the formal drawing room, where tea was served with ritualistic precision that only postponed the inevitable. Morrison waited patiently, sipping his tea as if he had all the time in the world, before finally placing the cup delicately back on its saucer. Miss Ashford, let us speak frankly, he began, leaning slightly forward. I understand that exceptional circumstances may have affected your judgment. Therefore, I am willing to overlook this temporary hesitation. We can proceed with the marital arrangements as originally planned. It is not a temporary hesitation, Penelope said, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. It is a definitive decision. I cannot marry you, Mr. Morrison. I apologize for any inconvenience caused, but my answer is final. Morrison's face hardened almost imperceptibly. I see. And would this sudden decision have nothing to do with a certain railway engineer I heard rumors was present at the derailment? The silence that followed was dense as fog. Penelope felt the blood drain from her face, but forced herself to maintain a steady gaze. I fail to see how my acquaintances are relevant to this discussion. You fail to see, Morrison laughed, a dry, humorless sound. My dear young lady, everything is relevant when it comes to protecting investments, and I have invested considerable time and resources in our agreement. My daughter is not an investment, Lord Henry intervened, his voice carrying an authority that years of financial mismanagement had not entirely managed to erase. She is a person with the right to her own choices. Choices have consequences, Lord Ashford. Morrison turned to face him directly. As I mentioned in my letter, I have close relationships with several of your creditors. It would be regrettable if they decided they could no longer wait patiently for their payments. That is blackmail, Lady Margaret said coldly. It is business, Morrison corrected. In the financial world, loyalties and favor are currencies as valuable as gold. If the Ashford family chooses to alienate me, my allies will naturally react accordingly. Penelope rose, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Then do what you must, Mr. Morrison. Call in the debts, ruin our reputation, use all your considerable influence against us. But you will not have me as your wife. I would rather face poverty and social ostracism than spend a single day as your property. The words came out with a force that surprised her, echoing through the formal drawing room. Morrison slowly rose, his expression transforming from calculated condescension to something more dangerous. Genuine anger gleamed in his eyes. "You are a fool," he said softly, each word cutting like glass. "To throw away security, comfort, social standing, all for a romantic illusion born of trauma. When your engineer realizes the burden you represent, when creditors seize this estate and your family is forced to live on charity, you will remember this moment and regret your stupidity." "Perhaps," Penelope replied, keeping her chin high. "But it will be my regret, the result of my own choices, and that is infinitely more valuable than security bought through the surrender of my soul." For a long moment, Morrison simply watched her, as if completely re-evaluating his understanding of the situation. Then, surprisingly, something akin to reluctant respect crossed his face. "You have more strength than I imagined," he admitted. "A pity such strength will be wasted in poverty." He turned to Lord and Lady Ashford. "I hope you understand what you have chosen. The consequences will begin immediately." He left without another word, his carriage disappearing down the oak-lined drive with a speed that suggested barely contained rage. When the sound of hooves faded, Penelope felt her legs give way, and she sank back into her chair. "It is done," she whispered, a part of her still unable to believe she had truly defied Morrison so completely. "There is no turning back now." "There isn't," her father agreed, moving to place a hand on her shoulder. "And we will face what comes together, as a family." Lady Margaret approached, hugging her daughter tightly. "You were magnificent," she murmured. "Your grandmother would have been very proud." But as she sat there, surrounded by the support of her parents, Penelope couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice. Morrison would carry out his threats, of that she was certain. And when the creditors came calling, when the doors of society began to close, when the full reality of their consequences manifested, would she still have the courage to defend her decision? A messenger arrived at dusk. Riding furiously down the drive as if pursued by demons. Penelope watched from her bedroom window as the young man dismounted precipitately, almost tripping in his haste to reach the main door. Minutes later, a maid knocked on her door with unusual urgency. "Miss Penelope, your father requests your presence immediately in the study. There is a gentleman insisting on seeing you." Penelope's heart quickened. Had Morrison returned so quickly? But when she descended the stairs and entered her father's study, it was not the banker she found there, but James Cooper, his appearance revealing a hurried journey and deep concern. "James," she exclaimed, briefly forgetting propriety in her surprise at seeing him. "We did not expect you for another week." He turned at the sound of her voice, and the intensity in his eyes made something stir within her. "I received troubling information this morning in London. Morrison has moved quickly, contacting creditors, spreading rumors. I had to come at once." Lord Henry, seated behind his desk, seemed to have aged several more years in that single day. "Mr. Cooper brings news. 3 of our main creditors have demanded full payment within a week, simultaneously." He paused, the weight of the words hanging heavily in the air. "It's no coincidence. It's a deliberate orchestration." Penelope felt the world tilt slightly, as if the derailment were happening again in slow motion. "A week, that's impossible. Even with James's funds, we cannot liquidate everything so quickly." "No," James agreed, moving closer to her. his presence comforting even amidst the impending disaster. But I have an alternative plan. It is risky and requires considerable trust from all of you. He looked between Penelope and her father. I need you to understand that what I propose may seem reckless at first glance. Lady Margaret entered at that moment, clearly informed of the situation by the grim expression on her face. Mr. Cooper, any plan at this point is welcome. Morrison has chosen war, and we must be prepared to fight. James nodded, extracting documents from his leather satchel. I have spent the last few days consulting with fellow engineers and investors I have worked with. There is a new railway project being proposed, a line that will connect Manchester to Liverpool via a more efficient route. The main investors are seeking additional partners, people willing to commit capital in exchange for substantial returns once the line is operational. Investment, Lord Henry repeated, skepticism tinging his voice. My imprudent investments brought us to this situation. Why would new investments be different? Because this is not blind speculation, James replied with conviction. I have personally worked on the calculations. The projections are conservative but solid. More importantly, I know the men involved. They are respected engineers, not speculators seeking quick profits. He spread papers across the desk. If we invest my funds and a portion of what remains of your family's liquid assets, we could generate sufficient returns within 6 months to satisfy the creditors and still retain Ashford Hall. 6 months, Lady Margaret said slowly, but the creditors demand payment in 1 week. That is why we must negotiate. James turned to Lord Henry. Sir, your family has a reputation established over generations. Some creditors may be swayed by Morrison, but others will respect the Ashford family's history of honor. We need to approach each one individually, explain the situation, offer revised terms that guarantee payment with interest within a specific time frame. Penelope watched her father process the words, seeing hope and fear battle on his face. And if the creditors refuse, if Morrison has completely poisoned our reputation, then we declare bankruptcy and lose everything, James said with brutal honesty. But at least we will have tried. And even in the worst-case scenario, my personal funds can ensure your family has a place to live, albeit modestly. The silence that followed was heavy with considerations of possible futures, paths that branched in radically different directions. Penelope moved to the window, observing the complete darkness that enveloped the gardens. Somewhere out there was the world she had known all her life, social structures and expectations that seemed solid as stone, but revealed themselves to be fragile as glass when challenged. There is another consideration, she said, turning to face them. If we proceed with this plan, James will be risking everything. His savings, his reputation, his future. If we fail, he will be dragged down with us. Her eyes met his across the room. I cannot ask such a sacrifice from someone I have known for only weeks. James crossed the room in quick strides, stopping respectfully near her, but close enough that he could see every nuance of expression on his face. You are not asking. I am offering. And it is not a sacrifice when it comes to protecting people who matter. But why? The question came out as a desperate whisper. Why would you risk so much for us? You barely know me. You could find another young lady, one without a ruined family and powerful enemies. Because, James said softly, aware that her parents were watching but clearly determined to speak the truth regardless. On that train, in those hours before the derailment, I saw something in you that I have searched for all my life. Authenticity, the courage to question the path laid out for you, the ability to dream beyond the limitations imposed by society. He paused, choosing his next words carefully, and in the disaster that followed when death lurked so near, I understood that some connections transcend time and logic. I cannot rationally explain why I know you are the person I want by my side as I build bridges and face challenges. I simply know. Tears burned in Penelope's eyes. What if we are not strong enough? What if Morrison wins and we lose everything? Then we will rebuild, James replied with devastating simplicity. Together, if you will have me. Separately if you decide the price is too high. But at least we will have fought for our own choices, instead of surrendering to destinies determined by others. Lord Henry rose, moving around the desk to stand beside his daughter. "Penelope, the final decision is yours. If you choose to end this courtship now, releasing Mr. Cooper from his obligations to our family, no one will judge you. God knows you owe no more sacrifices." Penelope looked at her father, seeing love and concern on his worn face. She turned to her mother, who watched with a complex expression that mingled maternal fear and something akin to pride. Finally, her eyes returned to James, and in that face she saw a future different from what she had imagined all her life, but infinitely more true. "When I was a child," she began, surprised by the firmness in her own voice, "I used to explore the fields beyond the estate. There was a specific place, a hill where you could see for miles in all directions. I felt free there, as if the whole world were open to me." She smiled sadly. "Then I grew up and learned that young ladies do not wander freely through fields. I learned about propriety and duty and all the invisible cages that society builds." "Penelope," her mother began, but she raised her hand gently. "I am not blaming anyone. You tried to prepare me for the world as it is, but perhaps the world does not need to remain as it always has been." She turned completely to James. "I accept your plan, its risks and possibilities, and more than that, I accept the proper courtship you offered, with full knowledge that it may lead nowhere if we discover we were mistaken about this connection." "And if we are not mistaken?" James asked softly. "Then we will build bridges together," Penelope replied, allowing herself to smile genuinely for the first time in days. "Literal and metaphorical ones," Lady Margaret softly sobbed, covering her mouth with her hand. Lord Henry cleared his throat loudly, emotion clear on his face, and James, controlled and respectful throughout the conversation, finally allowed himself to show the relief and joy he felt. "Then we begin tomorrow," he said, turning to practical matters with a determination that Penelope was beginning to recognize as an essential characteristic of his nature. "We will visit each creditor personally. We will present the numbers, appeal to their sense of justice, do whatever is necessary to buy time." They worked late into the night, planning strategies and preparing documents. James knew the financial world better than the Ashfords imagined, having navigated it for years, securing funds for his engineering projects. His confidence was contagious, and for the first time since Morrison had left, Penelope felt genuine hope begin to replace despair. When they finally retired for the night, it was past midnight. James was lodged in one of the guest rooms, the estate still maintained despite everything. Penelope was about to ascend the stairs when he softly called her name. "Miss Ashford." "Penelope." The intimacy of her given name made her heart quicken. "Thank you for trusting me. I know it is much to ask when we have known each other for so little time." "Time is a strange measure," Penelope replied thoughtfully. "I knew Morrison for months through formal social interactions, but I never truly knew him. I have known you for hours under extraordinary circumstances, but I feel I have seen your essential character." She paused, gathering courage. "Is that not irrational?" "Perhaps rationality is overrated," James said with a smile that lit up his tired eyes. "Bridges are built through precise calculations and exact measurements, but before the numbers, before the plans, there is an intuition about what is possible. Sometimes we need to trust that intuition." They remained thus for a prolonged moment, aware of the impropriety but unable to break the spell. Finally, James bowed formally. "Good night, Miss Ashford. Sleep well. Tomorrow we begin to rebuild." "Good night, Mr. Cooper," she replied, ascending the stairs with a lighter heart than she had carried in months. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. They visited creditors, some sympathetic and willing to negotiate, others inflexible under Morrison's influence. James presented investment projects with an enthusiasm that swayed even the most skeptical. Lord Henry, initially hesitant, found new energy working alongside the young engineer, a rediscovery of purpose he had lost under the weight of financial failures. Penelope accompanied them when appropriate, observing James navigate the business world with a skill that rivaled any aristocrat born to such a position. But unlike Morrison, who used power to intimidate, James built bridges through mutual respect and genuine integrity. A week after Morrison's ultimatum, they secured revised agreements with 2 of the 3 main creditors. The third remained inflexible, clearly under the bankers' direct pressure. It was enough to avoid immediate bankruptcy, but the situation remained precarious. "We need more time," James admitted during a family meeting in the study. "The railway investment is solid, but returns take months to materialize." "Then we will buy time," Penelope said with a determination that surprised even herself. "We will sell whatever needs to be sold. We will reduce expenses to the absolute minimum. We will do whatever it takes to survive until the investment bears fruit." Lady Margaret nodded slowly. "There are jewels that can be sold, valuable tapestries, some pieces of silver that are not essential. And I can take on additional commissions," James added. "There's a project in Bath that has requested my consultation. The fees would help." They worked together, the family and the stranger who was quickly becoming much more, building the plan piece by piece. And through the process, Penelope saw something remarkable happen. Her parents, who had drifted for years in a marriage of convenience that had cooled into distant cordiality, rediscovered partnership. Working side by side against a common adversity, they remembered why they had chosen each other decades ago. A month after the derailment that changed everything, Penelope was in the garden when James found her. Autumn had advanced, leaves covering the paths in a golden and crimson carpet. He offered his arm and she accepted it naturally, walking together through the decaying beauty. "I received word from the investors today," he said, and there was suppressed excitement in his voice. "The project has been approved. Construction begins in the spring." "That means," Penelope began, barely daring to hope. "It means we will survive. Ashford Hall is safe." James stopped, turning to face her fully. "And it means we have completed the first challenge, but there is another that needs to be faced." Penelope knew what was coming. She felt it in the air like electricity before a storm. "The courtship," she said softly. "We have spent this month working side by side, fighting financial and social battles together. But we haven't had time for the most important aspect, getting to know each other outside of crisis contexts." James took her hand, and this time there were no gloves between them, just the warmth of skin against skin. "Penelope Ashford, permit me."